how well people take care of their cars, but not their own bodies. You know, you can replace any car that you want. Really, it's gonna be expensive, but you can replace it. Your body, not so much, right? And you can, but that comes with the consequences, right? You're gonna have to sacrifice money, time, recovery, quality of life. So if you make that point to people and you get them to see just how well they take care of their cars and not their own bodies, it's just, whoa, mind-blowing. But anyone else have any ideas as to how it applies to the human body aside just from being able to train that movement pattern so we have an idea? Let's think about the tires blowing out, right? Blowout.
Your injury.
Sounds like injury, right? Yeah, like your knee blown out, right? I don't know what was so funny about knee injuries.
Oh no, I'm just laughing because every like blowout is like so obvious, but none of us got it.
Except for you.
No, I didn't get it either. I was like, damn, I can't believe I didn't.
Oh, okay, yeah. So, you know, we want to blow out a tire, right? So if you're only training in one plane of motion, right? Let's say you only do sagittal plane stuff, right? You do squat, you do lunge, step ups, everything's just deadlifts, everything's front and back. You're only developing, mainly, I shouldn't say only, but mainly developing the muscles responsible for that movement pattern. But you're also, along with training those muscles, you're also over time wearing down the joints in that same way. And then what you're not doing, if say you don't do frontal plane or transverse plane, is you're neglecting the stuff, the control of those frontal plane movements, which, by the way, are going to be become stabilizers for the sagittal plane stuff. So if you do only sagittal plane stuff, front and back stuff, sure, you'll get decently strong at that, but it's not going to work for very long, right? You're going to start running into those roadblocks. If you start training frontal plane stuff along with that, now you're also developing the musculature on the outsides and insides of your body, which helps stabilize further for those front and back movements. So your front and back movements will get stronger just by spending some time doing side to side. The same can be said with the transverse plane because it involves all, well, I shouldn't say all three, but both sagittal and frontal plane components. Am I making sense so far? Am I lost anyone yet? Okay. So not only does it help you actually train that movement pattern so your brain has an idea of what's going on, but also it helps prevent injury. And you know, that's one thing where it comes in human application is injury prevention. But if we think of rotation, I guess actually we can come back to this point. Where do we see a transverse plane in action? I'll go back to that there's a second part to the human application, but where do we actually see the frontal plane in action? There's literally not going to be a wrong answer to this one, heads up.
A golf swing.
Okay, perfect, there's one. Let's get more simple.
Lunges.
Great. Kind of, yes. Yeah, on a micro level, but yeah, that can be. Yes.
Bench press.
Walking.
Bench press, sure. You guys are starting to get the picture?
Yeah.
There's rotation present in everything, right? In every movement that we do, there's components of rotation in it. Because if we look at in a second we'll actually take a closer look at it, but if we think about the joints responsible for those movements, we have joints that are stable and joints that are mobile, right? So we have the knee joint, which we want to be stable, but we also have a ball and socket joint in our hip. That's a mobile joint, right? That's a spinning joint. We want rotation in that ball and socket. That's its job. So if you have anything involving the hips, guess what? You also have a component to rotation, and that's why the lunges counts as a bit of rotation in bench press too, in the shoulder. Because you go through internal and external rotation in that shoulder. Your squat, you have external rotation in the hip. And then walking actually is pretty interesting because even though it seems like it's a pretty simple movement, it's very complex. And the things that have to happen in order to do that sets the table for everything else. You know, being able to handle those shear forces, but also be able to resist against, you know, things trying to take you side to side. So yeah, it's present in absolutely everything that we do. It is everywhere. Okay, so now if we think about sport like the golf swing, and we want to have rotation involved, why do we
Let's take that golf swing example. Why do we rotate in our golf swing?
To generate torque and power. Exactly, right? You're trying to generate as much force and torque as possible, right, in a short amount of time. So if we're able to rotate efficiently and you're able to actually train that transverse plane, we're also going to maximize our power production. The more we can generate that rotational force, the more power we're going to be able to produce. So Javier, you asked the question on your sheet, right? Why is it important? Well, why do you think it's important?
So it helps prevent injuries, and then as an athlete, even for soccer players who are kicking the ball,
especially,
we're torquing the rotating hips so we can generate that power.
Yeah. Well, why else is it important?
Same thing too. We use it in everyday life.
Okay. And you know, even though soccer traditionally isn't a transverse plane sport, right? It's not like golf or tennis or baseball, right, where it's really rotationally involved. There are elements of rotation involved in soccer, so it makes sense, especially if you're changing direction, right? That's a component of the transverse plane. You're rotating on an axis. So, is it important? Yes, obviously it is important. Okay, so hopefully I've fired you guys up a little bit for the transverse plane. Now let's talk about how we actually get there. Going back to you guys remember the joint by joint approach, like the alternating joint theory, where you look at the ankle is a stable and mobile joint, knee is a stable joint, hips keep moving up the chain. So if we take a look at some of the joints involved, smiley face means yes, rotation is allowed. So our ankles are able to rotate. They're able to not only go in the sagittal, frontal planes, but they're also able to do both and swivel and pivot going into the transverse plane. So rotation is able to happen there. Ball and socket of the hips and shoulders, that's supposed to be able to rotate. Our T-spine, where the rib cage is, that's supposed to be able to rotate. And same thing as our ankle, our wrists are supposed to be able to rotate as well. And then, if you want to get further into it, your C-spine, your neck, you're supposed to be able to rotate. Your fingers are supposed to be able to rotate. But we're not going to worry about that for this lecture. And then in places that aren't supposed to rotate, we have our knees, our lower back, lumbar spine, and our elbows. So, have I lost anyone so far as going from this first section, moving forward into the next one? We're all on the same page so far. So what happens when we have rotation in a place that it's not supposed to be in? Why are we not supposed to be rotating through the knees, the lower back, or the elbow? Malia, I haven't heard from you yet.
Well, the elbows and the knees, they're hinge joints, so they only go. They're not supposed to rotate, right?
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna. That's why I wanted, when I was writing this down, I wanted to put a little asterisk on the elbow. And I don't know if it really, yeah, I guess it's the elbow. We have the radius and the ulna. They can spin around each other. But generally speaking, we don't want shear forces going across the elbow. So yeah, I just want to make sure I make that point, just so we're not, forgetting about that, because those two being able to spin around each other is important. But generally speaking, in movement, we want that to be stable. So what happens? What happens when the knees and elbows experience rotation?
They're doing a job they're not designed to do very well, so they start feeling discomfort and things tighten up everywhere else.
Mm-hmm.
And the muscles that are supposed to be doing it, they fail and they become weak.
Yeah, so it just presents huge problems up and down the chain, right? So it's not just a problem with those joints themselves, but it's also on a neurological level an issue, right? We start training bad habits, allowing bad habits to not only be present in the joints that aren't supposed to be doing that job, but also the joints that are supposed to be doing that job, like the hips and the shoulders, aren't. Right? They're getting used to not doing that job, so it creates a lot of bad sequence of events. So when we're looking at how we get there, it's really important that we understand where we're supposed to be and not supposed to be experiencing rotation. And having that foundation leads into the second point where we actually start looking at how stability and mobility play in with each other. So here I have stability and mobility equal torque. I always like to use the tetherball pole example. If you have a tetherball pole that's also spinning around with the tetherball, we'll never be able to play the game because the ball won't be able to actually wrap around the thing. But because the pole is stable and the ball is able to spin around it, now we have a system where we have stability first and mobility is able to occur because we have a stability component anchoring it down. And if you really wanted to look at it, as that ball starts winding around that thing, it gets faster and faster as it starts winding around the pole, right? So it's creating more torque, right? So the more rotation that happens, the more torque is being produced. So we understand that stability precedes mobility, and I always go back to this, but it's super important, that bracing sequence, right? And what is that bracing sequence for Mike? Anyone know? Bracing sequence. You guys have been here.
Oh, I thought you were asking.
No, I'm saying for him. For him.
Oh.
Let's educate Mike real quick while he's in here.
Brace. What? What am I bracing?
What are we bracing, guys? Come on, you guys have been here.
Abs, glutes, lats.
Okay. All right. So abs, side, butt squeeze, shoulders down and back. And why do we want to have that present first? Why is that bracing sequence always first in anything that we do?
Keeps everything nice and neutral, right?
Okay. Yeah. It helps set the table. Now that's
Integrity of the spine.
right. So that's what the core is doing, right? That's what the abdominal wall and all that's doing. But what about butt squeeze, shoulders down and back? What's that helping do too?
Making sure that your delts don't go forward.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Or,
Take a small step back and just look at the role of the shoulders and the hips. What are we doing first with them rather than, let's say, our triceps and biceps?
trying to get them back into neutral.
Think about tension. You want to help Josh out? Mike?
What does your lats connect to?
Your butt.
Your hip
Your
complex.
hip. Oh, your hip. Yeah, exactly.
So it helps stabilize hip complex as well.
Right.
What?
So that's actually, I wasn't even going to go there, but yeah, it's very true.
Oops.
No, that's good. That's good.
You're good?
No, you're great. Thanks, Mike. So that's true, but we're also placing tension where it needs to be first, so that it doesn't get caught somewhere else.
Got it.
You know what I mean? So we're relaxing everything except abs, side, butt, squeeze, shoulders down and back. So we have tension in the areas that's supposed to have tension, and we're not taking that tension somewhere else.
Got it.
Right? So now we're setting the table for actually having the muscles responsible for that rotation being pre-activated and doing their job. And I have, not me personally, but we want to think of it as a bottom-up approach. So if you're looking at sport, right, especially things like golf or lacrosse, or even soccer, right, with your goalkeeper doing a kick from the ground, right, being able to wind up and actually approach it, you're going to want to generate that power from the floor, right? You want to have the big parts of your body generating as much force as you possibly can, so you can transfer it through the rest of the body and wherever else it's going. So, along with that bracing sequence, we want to make sure that we're grounding. So, what are we doing with our feet and how that energy is transferred through to the hip sling, through the core, through the T-spine, through the shoulder sling, and then out through whatever implement that you're actually using. Whether it be a discus or a javelin, a soccer ball, or let's say you're not even letting go of an implement. Let's say you're doing a cable rotation, right? You want that implement to be the last thing that moves, right? It makes no sense to do a cable rotation with just your shoulders, right? Just pushing that across and then having everything else follow afterwards, right? You're not going to be able to do as much weight, nearly as much weight as you could if you actually got your lower body started first and followed through with the implement. So that's where we're at bottom up approach. We want to think about going from generating power from the floor and moving upwards. Well, it's the same thing in every other movement, so it's not another thing I have to think about, right? It's just bring it to your attention. You're already having to do this and everything else. That's where the abs, side, butt, squeeze, shoulders down and back comes from. So going into the mobility portion, now that we have stability anchored down, and we have the mobility portion, anyone see, why am I blanking on it now? Adam Sandler's golf movie. Happy Gilmore. Obviously, you've seen Happy Gilmore. I was hoping that would have been a little bit more smooth. But I've been wanting to use this line. It's all in the hips, right? So it's all in the hips. It's all in the hips, but sort of, right? It's not only in the hips, right? So we have to look at it again, bottom up, to look at how everything else plays. But the hips is like one of the major conduits for that energy transfer. Because if we break at the hips, we've just lost everything else. So being able to generate power from the hips, and then also understanding the relationship of the hip and the shoulder and how it's different than the frontal and sagittal planes. So our hips and our shoulders, right, when we're doing a frontal or sagittal plane movement like squat or even like a side lunge, we want our hips and shoulders moving in what way in relationship to each other?
Parallel.
Okay, parallel. Another word for parallel would be in sequence, right? Together, right? We want them moving together. Okay? So now let's take it a step further and look at it in the transverse plane. Why do you think I have these two separate from each other? If we have frontal and sagittal plane movements and we want the hips and shoulders to move together, and the transverse plane I have separate from that, we want those to move. Deductive reasoning.
Wait, can you say that one more time?
So, hips and shoulders, right? In our frontal and sagittal plane movements like squat, side lunge, we want them moving together, right? Right, so together, there's 50-50 shot. 50-50, okay? So together is already used. Transverse plane and sagittal and frontal plane are separate from each other. What do we think we want the transverse plane or hips and shoulders to move? Separate from each other, right? Yes, separate. This is also known as, oh, that's weird. Disassociation. Disassociation. All right, so we're trying to disassociate our hips and our shoulders from each other. Okay? So if we thought trying to teach movement so that having our clients or ourselves moving our hips and our shoulders together is hard, separating them is a whole other can of worms, right? Because now you have two segments of your body that you're having to do opposite things with. But it's actually much, much, much more simple than that. Yeah, I gave you the more complicated version first because I wanted to just throw that out there. But if we really want to think about it, these two, our hips and our shoulders are still pretty much doing the same thing. The relationship, the concept of the relationship rather, is even though in one they're moving together and the other they're moving separately, if we look at the together one first, that's going to be the easier one to look at. If they're moving together, we have the shoulders going one direction and the hips going the opposite direction, right? So if we're to look at, like, let's say this was a scale, right? We have on both sides, and we have more weight on one side, we want to even things out. We need a counterbalance against that to balance the two out, right? So now they're level, they're together, and they're moving together at the same time, same rate of speed. So they're counterbalances to each other. So one side's doing one thing, other side's doing the exact opposite thing. In the transverse plane, even though they're moving separate from each other, they're still counterbalances to each other, right? So the hips and shoulders are always going to be counterbalances to each other. So all it is just understanding that they share a counterbalance relationship, and then going into a little more detail, defining that counterbalance relationship, you have them moving together in a sagittal and frontal plane, and then moving separate from each other in the transverse plane. Now, I put separate and not opposite. because eventually they'll be moving the same direction, right? They're not moving opposite directions to each other. It's just one is moving before the other. And we want to make sure that we're actually able to do that first before we think about generating the rest of that range of motion. So I was kind of running out of room on the lower end here, and I kind of stopped it here. I can go into a little more detail, not on the whiteboard. But when we're teaching rotation, actually, forget that first. Anything question-wise on these first 2 points, because this sets the table for everything else. Anyone have any questions?
So they're still working at the same time, just in different ways?
Yes. Yes.
Not necessarily opposite ways.
Right. Yeah. Not necessarily opposite, but they're still they're one starts and the other one follows through. Right. They're not moving together at the same exact time.
They're not.
Yeah. They're not moving at the same exact time, or at least at the same rate of speed. They may be starting their movement at the same time. Think of a golf swing. Right?
As like that example. So what's like a common injury as far as like rotations go, like an ACL or something like that? What's the reason why injuries like that happen in a rotation motion?
I guess to answer the question more broadly would be failing. The body's failing to understand the joints that are and aren't supposed to be doing rotation. So let's take the ACL for example, right? ACL injuries most likely happen because of a valgus collapse of the knee, right?
Yeah.
So in a valgus collapse of the knee, what is happening to the knee?
It's rotating.
The knee is rotating, right?
Yeah.
If the knee is rotating, big problem, right? It's frowny face, not supposed to be rotating. And if the knee is rotating, that's because the hip isn't rotating, right? Isn't generating that rotation. So
as long as the hips are rotating, then the knee is okay to move.
yes, but I mean, there's other things that could be happening, but other things being equal, yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Generally speaking, yeah. If the hip is the one generating that rotational force, then the knee most likely is going to be protected. But it's not to say that, let's say your knee, taking that baseball example, the hip can start the rotation, but the knee just kind of never comes along, the rest of the leg doesn't come along for the ride. You can still rotate at the hip, but you're still also rotating at the knee because you're not allowing the ankle to rotate either.
Gotcha.
Does that make sense now?
Yeah, it does.
You see how we want the ankle and the hip to rotate so that the knees don't have to rotate?
Gotcha. Yeah.
Does that make more sense now?
It does. It does.
Okay, cool. Yeah, another good question. And you can take that relationship throughout the rest of the body, and you can see the same injuries, especially because our joints all repeat themselves. So, anyone else? Questions? These are all really good questions. I'm glad you're asking. Okay. So now when it comes to actually teaching this, because it already seems pretty complicated, but it's really not as long as you break down how to teach it in a more logical way. And we just think if we're trying to teach something to a client, or if you're trying to learn something brand new, are you gonna throw 1,000 things at someone for someone to think about and then expect them to learn it? Like, I'm gonna try to teach you calculus all in one day? No, right? So, but oftentimes as trainers, we get caught in that. We want to get so many things across in such a small amount of time, and we want to get to the fun stuff and not lose their interest. That we're just gonna start throwing things at them and pray that something catches on. But we just take a step back and just think stability precedes mobility, and taking that approach from the ground up, we can teach this in a much easier, effective way. So we want to think about working from the most stable and isometric positions possible, and start moving up to more unstable and dynamic positions. So as far as a stable position would be, right? Let's say we're teaching someone rotation, we're trying to get them to feel their obliques actually working. How do you think you want to position someone that's going to allow them to be stable without having to really think about all the other stabilizer muscles involved? Any position.
Standing.
Or standing.
Oh, standing's okay. What's a little bit easier than standing?
Sitting.
Sitting, right? Laying down would be one, but laying down would be like if someone is having like really bad back pain and you want to try to see, okay, what's going on with their ability to rotate. I wouldn't really put someone on the back. I'd rather have them sit down, especially because a lot of our stuff happens from us sitting down, like the backing out example where you're trying to reach back and look behind you. That's a seated position. Or like turning in your desk chair for something. And so the seated position comes up a little more often when we're moving. And what would be an isometric way we can train rotation?
Anti-rotation.
Anti-rotation, right? It's the opposite of rotation. It's preventing that movement. And why do you think that would be a good way to teach the activation of that area rather than jumping into dynamic?
I guess it's just better protects the spine that way.
Okay.
'Cause
Yeah.
if, let's say like you teach someone how to do like a torso twist before you teach them how to stabilize their core, then it's I can see a lot of bad coming from that.
Mhm.
They're able to move but not able to brace themselves.
Yeah. They're gonna get from point A to point B eventually, right? But it may not be on the inside the way that's supposed to be done. On the outside it might look fine, but on the inside, all hell is breaking loose.
Yeah.
I think another way we can put that is in an isometric sense, because they're trying to prevent movement and our muscles are stronger in preventing things from happening, or like the eccentric portion of things. In the isometric portion, you're going to be able to feel those muscles a little bit easier first. So you actually know where they are, you know how to activate them before you actually start teaching them to start moving things. So having someone starting from, let's say, a seated position and work on isometrically keeping you from rotating them with let's say their arms out in front and keeping them from rotating side to side is going to be a good way to actually just show them, okay, this is where those muscles are and this is their job. And you would teach them from the ground up, bracing sequence, and then make sure they're gripping the floor, getting their side butts active, bracing their abs, belly button pulled in, pulling their shoulder blades down and back, and then preventing the implement from whatever they're holding moving. And then working out from there. So now you have staying in a stable position and then going from an isometric into an eccentrically loaded thing. So let's say I have someone seated and they have their arms out in front and they're preventing me and they're getting really good at feeling those muscles working. Then I'll say, okay, now fight me, but let me win. Right? So I start eccentrically loading them up. They start feeling tension building up in those areas. Now they're able to brace and pull against that using that tension, only coming back to neutral, right? So they can just reload and just get really good at this motion, feeling these muscles drag and pull. Look what's happening to my hips, my shoulders. Hips are staying still, shoulders are disassociating. So I'm starting to teach that disassociation relationship. Okay. And then finally, keeping in that same position and then moving up from that eccentrically loaded to now being able to pull concentrically across from that position. Is all making sense so far? So we're just breaking down the movement and in a way that's easier to digest and feel for the client or for yourself, and eventually working them up into a more unstable and dynamic movement pattern.
What's an example of the unstable, like dynamic?
Unstable, so it's all relative, right? So a more unstable position than seated would be standing.
Okay.
A more unstable position than standing would be
One leg.
one leg, or that'd be maybe like 2 steps ahead, but we'll split stance,
Okay. Oh, okay.
right? Or half kneeling, or maybe full kneeling.
On a knee or whatever.
Right, yeah, kneeling down, one knee, half kneeling. And then, going from there. And unstable is a relative thing because you could be standing on the ground or you could be standing on a Bosu ball,
Right.
right? So there's more
Lots of
unstable.
options.
Yeah, there's plenty of variation. But one thing that I want to make sure that we understand too, when it comes to, especially when it comes to sport, and someone's in a rotation sport like baseball or golf, first things first, just because someone does that sport, don't assume that they know how to do rotation correctly. It's trust me, I've been around the block, I've seen a lot of people move, and just like how people have been working out for 20 years, doesn't mean they've been doing it right? Especially if they're getting hurt all the time. And so don't, just because someone's a golfer and they've been golfing for a while, don't automatically just throw them into the more dynamic, unstable thing. Let them prove themselves first. If they're able to actually stabilize and feel those muscles working isometrically, okay, fine. Now they move on to the next step, the next step, the next step. And if they have a problem with that, you can just explain to them, look, it's really important that we teach these things from the bottom up and make sure that we err on the side of caution, because the last thing I want is to assume things from you and then have you get hurt. Right? My job is to make sure we don't get hurt. And actually, if you look at the higher level of athletic training or sports performance training, they're not trying to get these athletes bigger, faster, stronger. They're just making sure that they're moving well. They're already big, fast, and strong. There's not a whole lot you're going to do. And actually, getting them to move better is going to get them bigger, faster, stronger, just as a result. So that's always going to take priority. So I think I'll end it there because I have to get going myself. But out of all this, did I lose anyone? I know I drew my stick figure. Again, I practiced this one. It's not as good as the other ones last week, but I really wanted to show how the transverse plane works from the hips. Vic actually brought up a great point when it comes to fascial lines in our body. There's no anatomical seams in our body that you can actually see. Any of the ones that you've read about have just been purposely cut in that line. Doesn't mean they're invalid, but the point I'm making is those seams or fascial lines that you may read about are really just kinetic chains. So this would be like a kinetic chain for the transverse plane, right? I have power going from, let's say, my right hip in my baseball swing, right? So if his right hip is generating the power, that power is coming through to this oblique, helping rotate the rest of the body through and finishing the swing from one end out the other. It's the same thing like if I was to throw a baseball, right? I'm going to have one hip starting that rotation and having the opposite shoulder finishing that rotation. Does that make sense? So that's just what that's for. But we all kind of grasp what's happening with the transverse plane, see why it's important and how we can start trading it. So when it comes to our potluck on Wednesday, this is gonna be an interesting one. I'm thinking that there's gonna be a lot of ab work, but abs aren't the only ones that are actually able to move in the transverse plane. We can make really, I just take our lunge example, we can make a lunge a transverse plane movement. You ever hear of transverse lunges or lunge rotations? Right, so that's just one example, but then you can make anything really a transverse plane. And get creative, because I want to hear what your thoughts are on how you apply the concept. So